Hi, everyone. Welcome to Talks in Chinese Humanities. My name is Minerva Inwald. I'm a Judith Nielsen Postdoctoral Fellow in Contemporary Art at UNSW Sydney, and I'm also the Seminars Officer for the Australian Society for Asian Humanities. Before we start today, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the land of the Wongal people, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and future. So the Talks in Chinese Humanities series has a number of sponsors, including the China Studies Centre at the University of Sydney, the Department of Chinese Studies at the University of Sydney, the Faculty of Art, Design and Architecture at UNSW, as well as the Australian Society for Asian Humanities. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague from the Department of Chinese Studies at the University of Sydney, Josh Stenberg, who's going to introduce our speaker for today. Thank you.
Hi, thanks to everybody for joining us today. It's a great pleasure to be able to announce the speaker, introduce the speaker, Jianwen Kong, who is an assistant professor of history at the National University of Singapore and the author of the very exciting book that we're going to hear about, I think, today, Diasporic Cold Warriors, Nationalist China, Anticommunism, and the Philippine Chinese, 1930s to 1970s. Jianwen was born and raised in Singapore, received his BA from Dartmouth College and his PhD in modern Chinese and international and global history from Columbia. His research straddles the fields of Sinophone history, Chinese migration and diaspora, the Cold War, and modern China in the world. And I'm going to shamelessly spruik an upcoming issue of Asian ethnicity that Jianwen and myself and Charlotte Sediadi of Singapore Management University have put together. It's almost entirely online, available now, including our introduction, and it is about the archipelagic perspectives on Southeast Asian Chinese ethnicity from the Philippines and Indonesia. So without further ado, let me hand over to Jianwen for his presentation, and then he'll be happy to do Q&A when he has finished. Over to you, Jianwen.
All right. So I'd like to thank Josh for giving me this opportunity to talk about my book, to reflect on how on some of its broader implications for the study of quote unquote Chinese and Cold War history. So I'll start by talking a little bit about what the book is about. The book explains how and why, at the height of the Cold War, the Philippine Chinese became the most ardent diasporic Chinese supporters of the Republic of China on Taiwan and its ruling Kuomintang Chinese Nationalist Party in the region, right? So for all the fears of Chinese communism at the time, the China that intervened the most extensively in any Southeast Asian country during this period was not the PRC, but rather the Republic of China. My story begins in the first half of the century, right, during which the Kuomintang institutionalized itself in the Philippines and clashed with pro-CCP Chinese left-wing organizations in the years leading up to the Japanese occupation. Right? And notably, during this period, the Philippine Kuomintang came to be dominated by a right-wing faction with ties to the ultra-right-wing quasi-fascist blue shirts in China. And the Secretary General of the Kuomintang in Taiwan from 1985 to 1987, a gentleman by the name of Ma Shuli, right, was briefly part of this right-wing faction in the Philippines in the 1930s. By the end of the 1940s, so after the Second World War, right, following a period of bloody struggle, right, between left and right-wing Chinese factions in the Philippines, most Philippine Chinese left-wing leaders had in fact returned to China, right, and this enabled Taipei, right, the ROC to consolidate its hold over one of the smallest Chinese communities in Southeast Asia, with the participation of the Philippine government. Although not, as I'll explain shortly, not the United States. Right? And so this is a Cold War narrative, but it's not a Cold War narrative that quite fits, I think, with our understanding of the Cold War in the region. The core of the book, right, is the period from the 1950s to the 1970s, right? A period that was characterized by nationalist China's near hegemony over Chinese education and key community institutions in the Philippines, such as the Federation, right, of Filipino Chinese Chambers of Commerce, the Philippine Chinese Anticommunist League, as well as Chiang Kai-shek College, or Chiang Kai-shek High School, as it was known at the time, right? And so it was through these institutions that Taipei was able to mobilize the overseas, the Philippine Chinese, right? Most of whom I should note were legally, quote, Chinese nationals, right, unquote. Taipei was able to mobilize them in support of its overarching goal of counterattacking the mainland, right, and opposing communism and resisting Russia. And so during these decades, visits to Taiwan, right, such as those you see here, were common. The cover of my book, right, so the cover of my book is actually based on the photo on the left of the screen, which shows Chiang Kai-shek, right, greeting Filipino Chinese students who were in Taiwan for military service, right, in 1956. On the right, you can see a Philippine Kuomintang member, right, presenting Chiang Kai-shek with what is, in fact, a three-dimensional gold map of China, right, in 1950. So more perniciously, the Kuomintang, right, the local Kuomintang, but with ties obviously to Taipei, right, collaborated with Philippine military intelligence to silence dissenting and heterodox voices within the community, right, chiefly by identifying them as communists. Many such persons ended up being deported to Taiwan, including the journalists Quintin and Rizal Yutong of the Chinese Commercial News, which was the Philippines' most widely read Chinese language newspaper at the time. Right? So the so-called crime of these two journalists, right, was to have provided balanced news coverage of developments in both China and Taiwan at the time. Their crime, their offense was to have argued in favor of Chinese cultural integration into the Filipino nation state, right, in opposition to the very Sino-centric, almost chauvinistic worldview of Kuomintang conservatives. And so my book ends with these two men in the early 1970s, right, after which things changed. Under martial law, President Ferdinand Marcos of the Philippines, right, simplified the naturalization process for foreign nationals, right? He established formal diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China in 1975, as you can see from this image. And over time, in the decades that followed, right, Kuomintang influence waned in proportion to the strengthening of ties between Manila and Beijing. And that's how we get to the present day, but my book doesn't really talk very much about that. So let me move on to talking about some of my historiographical, scholarly interventions. Right? In the end, for a bunch of practical reasons, I settled on making three key arguments. Right? I had to sort of pick and choose my scholarly engagements, given how my topic doesn't really fit easily into sort of conventional area studies fields. So in the end, I settled on three interventions, right? The first of which has to do with how we understand the KMT, right? And this argument is really primarily meant for the scholars of modern China, right, and Taiwan, particularly those in Anglo-American academia, right, who have written about the KMT, right? Chiefly from area studies perspectives, right? Chiefly from the perspective of the Kuomintang's nation-building strategies and ideology during the Nanjing decade in China, right? The period from about 1927 to 37, right? During the Sino-Japanese War that followed, right? And also in Taiwan, obviously, after 1949, And so this is how I encountered the Kuomintang in graduate school, right? Through scholarship by historians such as Brian Sway and Maggie Clinton, right? And I think it's typically how historians and the general reading public today envision the party. So in my conversations with modern China historians, they would frequently express surprise that there was a KMT in the Philippines. But if you read Kuomintang propaganda from the 1930s onwards, or dig into its archives, right, dig into sort of ROC Foreign Ministry archives, it becomes readily apparent that the party state was very interested in the mobilization of persons, right, whom it referred to as overseas Chinese or Huaqiao, right? And that it's, if you look at its 1929 nationality law, for example, right, you'll see that that this law defined overseas Chinese, right, as Chinese nationals, ROC nationals, according to the principle of jus sanguinis, right, or blood right. And so by building on a much less sizable and older body of scholarship on the Kuomintang in Southeast Asia and the Americas, right, I make the case for understanding the Kuomintang ROC party state as a networked and transnational organization, right, that connected Taiwan and China to Chinese communities abroad. And although this organization overlapped with and made use of the kinds of migration networks that scholars such as my former advisor Adam McKeown, right, have studied, it was a very different type of transnational formation. One whose branches, schools, civic institutions, and diplomatic organs were both embedded in overseas Chinese societies and linked hierarchically to the center, right, Zhongyang, wherever that center might be, right, Nanjing, Chongqing, and Taipei. And the flow chart on the right, which is from my book, right, gives you a sense of that transnational organization. And so I think thinking about the Kuomintang transnationally, right, underscores its, the ROC's territorial incompleteness, right, and partial sovereignty from its inception in 1912, right, and hence this explains as well the party states turning outwards towards the South Seas region, towards Southeast Asia and beyond, right, in search of support. I should add here that my book isn't really about the CCP and the PRC, right? It focuses more on the Kuomintang and anti-communism, the Chinese left-wing movements from the 1950s onwards. But I do think we can think about the CCP diasporically, right? We can think about Chinese communism certainly diasporically, as my friend Tom Zhou has pointed out, right, in her book. I'd argue that despite the presence of ethnic Chinese CCP sympathizers overseas, both alleged and actual, right, the party itself, the Chinese Communist Party, during this period was not as formally institutionalized diasporically as the Kuomintang was. Right? Moreover, unlike the Kuomintang, the CCP after 1949 focused on nation building, right, in a more conventional territorialized sense. In fact, from the mid-1950s onwards, from around the time of the Bandung Conference onwards, it officially jettisoned, it officially distanced itself from sort of diasporic mobilization. Right? And this is quite unlike the Republic of China, which engaged in no such act of repudiation. Right? The Chinese, the ROC's nationality law that I pointed out earlier, right, was not in fact modified until the year 2000, when Taiwan, under DPP rule in Taiwan. So that's my first argument, right? The second argument is about explaining this three-way relationship between the Philippines, the ROC state, and the Philippine Chinese, right? And using this relationship to sort of rethink the Cold War in this part of the world. Right? So I characterize Taipei and Manila relations with respect to the Philippine Chinese as a relationship of what I call shared sovereignty. This term actually comes from political theorist, right, Stephen Krasner. It was, I argue, a marriage of convenience, right, characterized by shifting but relatively equal power relations between Taipei and Manila, and the willingness, right, of Manila to both allow the KMT to operate openly in the Philippines and to collaborate with the Kuomintang and the Chinese community in opposition to so-called Chinese communism. And so over the course of my book, I explained how Manila relied on ROC diplomats, it relied on local KMT activists to compensate for its own security forces' ignorance of Chinese, right, in policing and surveilling the Chinese community. Taipei, conversely, lacked the means of simply imposing itself onto the Philippines without Manila's participation and consent, right? And the limits of the Kuomintang's influence sort of beyond Taipei, I think, are evident when we look at other Southeast Asian countries during this period, right, where the Kuomintang was in fact heavily proscribed by governments in Malaya, Thailand, and South Vietnam, right? Governments that were anti-communist but were suspicious nonetheless of the Kuomintang. So this is what I think makes the Philippines sort of distinctive as a case study, if you will. So shared sovereignty is useful for me in engaging with narratives of the Cold War, right? So on the one hand, my book sort of does align with scholarship by the likes of Ang Ching-guan, right, and Nu Wenqing, who have called attention to how important fears of the PRC and the overseas Chinese as potential fifth colonists were to understanding the dynamics of the Cold War in this part of the world. But on the other hand, and this may come as a bit of a surprise to you, Diasporic Cold Warriors is not really about the United States, right? Even if the states involved were close allies of the United States, right? So the US is not absent from this book. I did quite a bit of research in US archives, but the US archival materials actually suggest that American involvement in the Philippine Chinese community was principally that of an observer and did not really go beyond disseminating print propaganda. It was the Kuomintang, right? It was Taipei that drove propaganda efforts on the ground, right? It was the KMT and the Philippine military, but not the United States, that did the dirty work of identifying and arresting so-called Chinese communists. So my book in that sense is a response to historians of the US and the world, and to the US-Asia binary that I think structures and limits our understanding of the Cold War in this region. So I decenter the United States, right? I emphasize the agency and relative autonomy of Asian and transnational actors in making Cold War anti-communism. And these relations between states and peoples help constitute what I call, adapting anthropologist Susan Bailey's term, concept of a socialist ecumene, right? An intra-Asian anti-communist ecumene, comprising KMT networks, right? Flows of Philippine Chinese students, teachers, tourists from the Philippines to Taiwan, right? And transnational anti-communist organizations as well. So that's my second argument. The third has to do with the importance of ideology to understanding Chinese identity. My book attempts to challenge prevailing narratives of Philippine Chinese history and society that are narrowly focused on ethnocultural identity and integration, on the business community, and which exclude Cold War politics and ideology. So take this book on the screen, for example, Chinoy, the story of the Chinese and Philippine life, right? This is a coffee table book produced by the leading Chino organization, Kaisa para sa Kalnaran. And in this book, the Kuomintang and Taiwan are conspicuous by their absence, right? Now, I think this is understandable, given that such narratives emphasize are meant to emphasize the contributions of Chinese migrants and their descendants to a multicultural Filipino nation, right, in response to endemic and persistent anti-Chinese racism, right, which unfortunately have intensified in recent years. And now KMT hegemony is well known, right, among older Chinoys, as my conversations with them reveal, but I think it's politically inconvenient for them, for the community to acknowledge how an earlier generation of Filipino Chinese, many of that early generation were vociferous supporters of a particular China. So we also find in what little scholarship there is on the post-war Filipino Chinese, right, and not just the post-war Filipino Chinese, I think we find an inordinate emphasis on the business community, right, whose interests are depicted as synonymous with those of Chinese society in general, right, which social scientists tend to depict as being relatively uninterested in China-centered politics, right, whom social scientists are interested in because of how they were able to adapt to discriminatory economic policies, for example. Right? So I think I came to notice a rupture between these oddly depoliticized narratives of, especially after 1945, right, and narratives of the pre-war period that are attentive, for example, to mobilization in support of the war of resistance. So how can we reintegrate politics into our understanding of the community after 1945? And so my argument in response to these narratives is as follows. First, we need to think about how the sharing of sovereignty, right, between Taipei and Manila, how transnational Kuomintang networks and Cold War ideology shaped Chinese identity in the Philippines, right? And how they were instrumental to how the Chinese fashioned themselves as ethno-ideological post-colonial subjects in the face of discrimination and prejudice. So I think we can go beyond tropes of hybridity and interculturation, beyond the narrow confines of ethnicity and culture, right? Because for many Philippine Chinese, as legal aliens, right, as ROC nationals, right, as ethnic minorities, performing the right ideology, so to speak, right, an ideology that Taipei and Manila shared, right. This was a means for them to perform, to prove that they were good residents of the Philippines, right. This was a means for them to ingratiate themselves with the Philippine authorities, to win intracommunal power struggles, and to even to profit by means of criminal activity. Right? So the image on the slide is an instance of how the Chinese publicly performed their ideological identities. And so ideology in this sense is not just about belief, but also about expediency, right? It can be tricky for historians, for scholars to parse the motivations of persons, right? The interiority of individuals, right? I think we prefer to study manifestations of such beliefs, right? And so in my case, that would be the performative aspects of Cold War anti-communism. So these instances of performing anti-communism range from forming civic organizations such as the Chinese Anti-Communist League, right, to fundraising in support of the ROC, to blackmailing and informing on suspected Chinese communists, right? And these practices, these social and cultural practices, helped Chinese mitigate racial prejudices towards them by emphasizing their ideological bona fides. I will also say that in the course of my research, it became obvious to me that the persons involved in the most ardent anti-communists weren't necessarily Chinese businessmen. Right? So I get asked a lot about the economic ties, right, between the Filipino Chinese and the ROC, and I'd be happy to say more. My short answer to that question for now is that such ties existed, but have not only proven difficult to study, right, but also that there isn't as significant a causal link between that and support for the ROC as we might think. My book, talks about sort of talks about business elites, but it's about more than just the business community, right? While business elites certainly supported the ROC, some of the most committed diasporic Cold Warriors were journalists, right? Were educators, journalists, media figures affiliated with the Kuomintang. And here are just a few examples of those persons, right? Sort of clockwise from the top left, you have Bao Shitian, right, who was the longtime principal of Chiang Kai-shek College, right? Here he is shaking hands with Chiang himself, right? There's Ma Shuli, right, who I pointed out earlier, right? A founding member of the Kuomintang in the Philippines, right? And a person who was affiliated with sort of the quasi right-wing faction of the Kuomintang in the Philippines that came to dominate the party entirely, right? There's radio host, right, Mary Yu, right, shown here receiving a bouquet of flowers on the occasion of one of her many visits to Taiwan, right? And finally, on the bottom left of the screen, you have a man named Xing Guangzu, right, who was the editor-in-chief of the Kuomintang Mouthpiece, right, the Great China Press in the Philippines, and was a literary critic as well. So another thing I'll say about ideology, right, has to do with resistance to the Kuomintang. Right? In the absence of a Chinese left-wing movement in the Philippines after the late 1940s, right, this is partly what I think made the Philippines sort of distinct. Right? In the absence of such a left-wing movement, where might one turn to for evidence of resistance, opposition, discontent with the Kuomintang? So my book is really a study in hegemony. But this hegemony was not uncontested. This contestation, I argue, manifested itself indirectly and obliquely as what I refer to as anti-communism or non-anti-communism, right? Rather than in the form of full-throated support for the PRC, because there was none of that, as far as I can tell. It would have been extremely risky for anyone to sort of come out in public and voice full-throated support for the PRC, right, as a member of the Chinese community at the time, right? So a good example of this anti-communism or / non-anti-communism is the Chinese Commercial News, the newspaper whose editors were deported to Taiwan, right? The CCN registered its discomfort with the ideological status quo by publishing articles that both praised and criticized the two Chinese governments at the time, right? The CCN was also critical of the Kuomintang's ethnocentrism and Chinese chauvinism and sought to perform, I think, sort of an alternative ethno-political subjectivity, a more Philippine-centered political subjectivity. And for all these reasons, right, the Yu Yutong brothers who ran the Chinese Commercial News ran afoul of the Kuomintang-dominated Chinese establishment, right? And as I explain in the final chapter of my book, right, were deported to Taiwan. So those are my three main arguments, right? My three interventions in sort of different fields of scholarship, right? The first has to do with the transnationalism of the KMT. The second has to do with the sharing of sovereignty between Manila and Taipei in the context of the intra-Asian Cold War. And the third has to do with how important ideology was to understanding Chinese identity in the Philippines during this period. I want to close, right, with a few thoughts on what I think are the broader implications of the book, right, on where we can go from here. So the first concluding thought I have is on questions of comparability and translatability. So my book, for all sorts of reasons, including practical reasons, right, is not a comparative history. Right? There are moments in which I look beyond the Philippines to other Southeast Asian countries. Right? I do think that the book supplies concepts and narratives and frameworks that translate across borders, right, and that can illuminate the Kuomintang elsewhere in the region, about which there is actually little scholarship, right? I think there are rich deposits of primary sources that we can draw upon, right, in Taipei itself, not least in Taipei itself, right? And that in sort of using the term, deploying the term shared sovereignty, I hope that others will think about how colonial and post-colonial states constrain the operations, or sort of to manage the operations of the Kuomintang among Chinese populations, right, in the name of assimilating them into national body politics. Second conclusion, right, is that I hope my book can help historians historicize relations between quote unquote China and Southeast Asia, right? So that I think it's tempting to trace a linear trajectory for those of us more interested in sort of contemporary developments and using history to understand contemporary developments. I think it's easy but problematic to trace a linear trajectory from the PRC then in the 1950s and 60s to the PRC today, right? And that rather than adhering to such a trajectory, I think we need to look to the ROC as an antecedent to the PRC. Right? That the ROC's involvement is an antecedent to the PRC's involvement in the region today, right? And so if we can, and historians have drawn comparisons, have made comparisons, right? Historical comparisons between the Kuomintang and the CCP as authoritarian Leninist regimes, right? I think we can also engage in diachronic analogizing between the historical Kuomintang and the contemporary CCP, right? For example, with respect to their shared commitment to promoting a certain ideas about Chineseness, right? In their efforts to sinicize or re-sinicize the region's Chinese. Right? So I had a conversation with a current employee of the Chinese Commercial News during one of my visits to Manila, right? A current employee whose father also worked for the paper, and he told me that Beijing's cultural diplomacy among the Philippine Chinese today resembles what Taipei was doing half a century earlier. So my third conclusion, my third and final concluding thought, right, touches on what this thing that I call Sinophone and global Chinese history. Right? So I hope that we, and by we here, I really mean, my interlocutors for the most part have been persons in North American area studies, right? That was the that was my graduate experience, my graduate school experience, right? I hope that we can move beyond Chinese history as a field that is centered on the mainland as a territorialized space for the unfolding of the so-called Chinese past. There have been quite a number of books, really excellent books written recently on Chinese diaspora and migration, including by Shelley Chan and Wayne Soon. But even Shelley and Wayne's books, I argue, are China-centric, right? In that they are principally concerned with how the diaspora changed China. Right? I would like to propose an alternative, non-exclusive, and constructivist approach, right? Inspired in part by the scholarship of Adam McKeown, right? By something known as critical Han studies, and obviously by Sinophone literary and cultural studies, right? I'm tentatively calling this global Chinese history because it emphasizes the experiences of and connections between persons, societies, states, in different settings that perceive themselves or perceived by others as Chinese. Right? And as a historian, I'm interested in moving beyond the kinds of literary and cultural texts that Sinophone scholars tend to be focused on. And so this approach to global Chinese history that I'm proposing, right, takes up processes of Sinicization and de-Sinicization in China, right, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Southeast Asia, right, in relation to, for example, to Manchus, right, to Uyghurs, to the indigenous peoples of Taiwan, to Chinois, right, to Hong Kongers and ethnic Chinese Singaporeans, right. It treats these processes as comparable, right, and that span geographies and that are enmeshed, obviously, in distinct historical contexts. Right? And I think this approach has political and ethical ramifications. The terms Chinese and China are powerful, but ambiguous and contested signifiers, right? And that racist demagogues and authoritarian states, such as the PRC today, right, such as martial law Taiwan, right, such as New Order Indonesia, have deployed these terms, Chinese and China, to categorize, essentialize, and inflict great harms on peoples. And so I think we need to sort of problematize and pluralize Chineseness and Chinese history. That concludes my talk. If you are interested in buying the book and are in this part of the world, right, in the Asia Pacific region, you can do so by going to Combined Academic Publishers, which is Cornell's distributor in this part of the world. And be sure you use the code CSFS2022 to get 30% off. Thank you very much.